Hi, everybody. We're just going to give folks a minute to join us here and let the room populate, and we will start shortly. It's great to see so many familiar names. Yeah, Ambassador McFarland, great to see you. Steve Hendricks, Roberta, it's great to see everybody. All right, let Zoom catch up to our enthusiasm here. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Jenna Ben-Yehuda. I'm the president and CEO of the Truman Center for National Policy and Truman National Security Project. We are really thrilled to have all of you here today to talk about the future of policy in the region. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, having spent the better part of 2 decades focused on regional policy and politics, and especially wonderful to have 2 friends join us here, Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez and Juan Gonzalez, and we'll be in conversation today with our terrific moderator, the TruAmericas Expert Group leader, Dave Heaton. From Truman. And I'll just offer a couple of words for those of you who are not familiar with our terrific panelists today. Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez is non-resident senior fellow with the Peter Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue, where she contributes to policy discussions focused on human rights, democratic institutions, government accountability, civil society engagement, and hemispheric cooperation. Dr. Chavez is also a senior advisor at the Center for Naval Analyses and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, from 2013 to 2017, Dr. Chavez served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs, overseeing strategy, policy issues, and government funding of hemispheric defense cooperation programs. From 2007 to 2012, Dr. Chavez served as advisor to the commander of U.S. Southern Command. And in this capacity, she traveled extensively throughout the region with the commander to strengthen U.S. defense relations. She received both her MA and PhD in political science from Stanford and her BA from the Wilson School at Princeton. And Juan Gonzalez is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Previously, he was associate vice president with the Cohen Group, where he led the firm's practice on Latin America and the Caribbean. He also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs and at the White House for 4 years as Western Hemisphere Advisor to Vice President Biden from 2013 to 2015, and as NSC Director for the region from 2011 to 2013. Dave Heaton is a national security expert with 14 years of experience in the region and is currently co-leader of the terrific TruAmericas Expert Group. Previously, Mr. Heaton was the Director of Caribbean Affairs at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he developed DoD's Cuba policy following the restoration of diplomatic relations. He holds graduate and undergraduate degrees from Georgetown and also studied at NDU's Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies. We have so much to get to. We have Secretary Pompeo headed to the region. We have recent endorsements starting to come out for the vice president. We have a region beset by tremendous economic and health challenges stemming from COVID and beyond. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Dave to get us started. Thanks so much for everybody joining us.
Great, and thank you again to our panelists, Juan and Rebecca, for joining us. And I want to extend a special welcome to all of our guests out in Zoomlandia who are not already a part of the Truman community. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that this event is meaningful for you. So as we were conceptualizing this event at the Truman National Security Project, we identified 5 strategic themes for U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. And those themes are restoring economic growth, protecting public health, combating climate change, advancing democratic values, and jointly responding to shared security challenges. So we're going to use those themes to guide our moderated Q&A to get started. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience afterwards. And I will just give a quick technical note to everybody. Your Q&A feature should actually already be enabled. So if you have those questions ready, or if a question comes to mind during the first part of our discussion, you can go ahead and type that in and they'll be ready and waiting for us when we get to the audience questions. So again, welcome everybody and thank you. Juan, if it's all right, I'll start with you. Our first question will be about restoring economic growth. The economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic is hammering Latin American economies just as it is here at home, threatening to reverse a generation's worth of growth of the middle class. According to the OECD, Mexico's GDP fell by 17.1% in the second quarter. Especially given how intertwined our economies are in North America. In your view, what can be done to restore economic growth, both at home and the region?
Well, thanks, David. And thanks to the Truman National Security Project for the invitation and for the opportunity to share the stage with somebody who I respect and admire greatly, Dr. Bill Chavez, and Jenna Ben-Yehuda, who not too many years ago, she and I took a trip to Guatemala and actually met with human rights and anti-corruption activists. So, you know, how far we've come since that trip. But look, David, that's a really good question. I think it's worth maybe taking a step back to look at the reality even before the pandemic started affecting the region, when we were seeing massive protests throughout the region that were a function of many things. But I think important ones were the reality that the prosperity that had benefited Latin America and the Caribbean did not benefit everybody, number one. Number two, that you had a region that despite GDP growth, you had a middle class that was very tenuous, and that what we're seeing now, obviously, is that any sort of economic shock sends people right back down to poverty, the lack of social safety nets, insecurity, rampant and grand corruption that exists in the region, and the predominance of transnational criminal actors are ones that are imposing headwinds on the region before the pandemic. But even kind of looking into the medium and long term, there are some challenges that the region has been facing that it's woefully unprepared for. One of them is that the world is undergoing a global energy transition. We've hit peak oil, and you have a region that is still very much dependent on commodities. Colombia, where I was born, its GDP, 20% of its GDP is still dependent on commodities, but also large economies like Mexico and Brazil. Two, you have the end of this demographic dividend that the region is undergoing. If you look at GDP growth before the pandemic for almost 2 decades, 15 years, GDP growth was a function of population growth, not of government policies. And so when you start seeing the end of this demographic dividend, you start asking yourself, how is the region going to continue to prosper? And if it can't, it's going to be stuck in these boom and bust cycles that lead to instability, et cetera. And I look forward to discussing those issues. And then again, the issue of, got to foot stomp it, the World Economic Forum last year did a survey where they asked major investors and businesses in Latin America and the Caribbean what they saw as the biggest challenge to invest in, and they said governance. So lack of institutional governance, democratic institutions, rampant corruption as defined as subsets of the governance issues are ones that are addressable, but seem to be these issues that are ones that Latin America just struggles to address regardless of the country. I would say Uruguay is probably the exception, Chile for the most part is the exception. So what can we do now, particularly in a world where we are in a pandemic that is threatening all the progress that the region has made, but maybe even posing a threat to the region's democratic tradition, an area that I know Dr. Bill Chavez has written a lot extensively about. And I think I got to go to, maybe this is the easy answer, David, but I think U.S. leadership is vital here. And just, I think it's 48 days out from the U.S. election. I have to say that the implications of the U.S. election have never been more important for Latin America and the Caribbean. Right now, what we need is a U.S. leadership that is going to not just focus on 3 countries, or frankly, it's Latin America policy like the one under the Trump administration, which has really been a South Florida electoral strategy as opposed to a regional prosperity strategy. we need US leadership that is going to really seize this moment, which is, I would compare, we can talk about this more and more, of like a Bretton Woods, Washington consensus type opportunity to really remake the US relationship with the hemisphere, where we need to look at the debt dynamics that are going to come out of the pandemic, the role of multilateral development banks and how they actually help promote equality and reduce corruption. And then more importantly, and so this is Vice President Biden has said publicly, is that, when we're actually looking at rebuilding and recovering from the pandemic, we can't just go back to the way things were. We really have to prepare for the world as it is, and it will be. And that means that any sort of investment in economic prosperity needs to really prioritize climate change and the technologies of the future as major investments. And those are opportunities, of course, that exist for the region. Even before the pandemic, you had, and then I'll shut up, is you had countries like Chile that were making major investments in solar. You had, before the Bolsonaro government, you had a Brazil that really was taking, making major investments into renewables. So, and Mexico was, before López Obrador, also making major commitments on climate. And we need to return to that, but also I think re-energize those conversations to make sure that economic engagement and prosperity and climate change are going hand in hand.
Great. Thank you for that answer. I really appreciate it. If it's all right, let's stick with the public health theme, since that has really just dramatically altered the way we think about everything, including regional relations. So Rebecca, I might turn to you. In an opinion piece for the New York Times in April, you said that the US's handling of COVID-19 was, quote, leaving the hemisphere more open to Chinese cooperation and ever more wary of American partnership. So how do you view the seeming emergence of great power competition between the US and China? And how would you recommend the US approach the issue in the region, both in terms of pandemic response and more generally?
Well, first, I want to thank the Truman Project and Jenna and Dave in particular for organizing this event and for highlighting the importance of Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a region that's too often overlooked or taken for granted, despite the fact that what happens to our closest neighbors affects directly our lives here in the United States. So thank you. And I also want to echo kind of Juan's words. It's just really great to spend this time with two very close colleagues and friends, both Juan and Dave. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So Dave, I'm not surprised that you asked a very meaty question. It's a great question. And I think probably the best way to get at it is to maybe start with the US response to the pandemic in the region and then talk a bit about China and great power competition. So when I look at the US response to COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean, I think it's actually really emblematic of our overall approach to the region under President Trump, and this kind of failure to treat the countries of the region like the essential partners that they are. So one of the things that we point out in the op-ed that you mentioned is that just as the number of cases in Latin America, COVID cases, started to spike, that's when the Trump administration announced that it was going to double military assets in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific to support the counter-narcotics mission. So, and I'm saying this as a former Pentagon official, instead of sending Navy destroyers or Coast Guard cutters, that was the moment when we should have started to surge humanitarian assistance. That didn't happen. And that's where China had the opportunity to step into the void. So COVID-19 is devastating Latin America and the Caribbean. In June, the World Health Organization, I think it was in June that they designated it the epicenter of the pandemic. I think we're at 300 deaths and counting when it comes to COVID-related deaths in the region. And 5 of the 10 hemispheres with the most, 5 of the 10 countries in our hemisphere, no, let me reframe that. 5 of the 10 countries globally with the highest mortalities due to COVID are found in our hemisphere. So you've got the United States, you've got Mexico, you've got Brazil, you've got Chile, and you've got Peru. And Peru now, currently, today, has the highest mortality rate due to COVID in the world. I really appreciate Juan's comments about economic recovery, because this has really devastated the economies of the region. ECLOC and the IMF have estimated that economic contraction for the region is going to be 9%. And I think it's going to be even greater than 9%. And Juan, I also just want to foot stomp your point about the impact of this on inequality and poverty in the region. You know, as you mentioned, what we're seeing really is, we're seeing this happening overnight. People who struggled so long to claw their way up into the middle class are falling below the poverty line basically overnight. And they're losing everything. We hear stories about, you know, families who are losing their homes and they're moving into the shanty towns or the slums, you know, the Villas Miserias in Argentina or the favelas of Brazil. And as you can imagine, these are the very areas where COVID is spreading the most. So it's really the most vulnerable that suffer the most, that are suffering the most as a result of this. You know, just before this this Zoom call, I read a statistic that I think it's 6 of 10 children in Colombia don't have access to the internet, so they don't have access to distance learning. So this is also creating, you know, great pressures when it comes to education and other social issues. So what should the US do? First of all, I think it's essential that the US treats pandemics as the national security issues that they are. Just like climate change. I think this is a wake-up call that infectious diseases are really, truly a threat to our national security. They transcend borders, and they require collective action. So, you know, this go-it-alone policy, it's actually really foolish. I mean, I don't think we can expect to address these sorts of issues on our own. So we've got to start to rebuild our partnerships and our alliances that we've let that we haven't nurtured, and that's putting it mildly. And it's going to take time to rebuild these partnerships and alliances, but we're going to need to do so in order to address things such as pandemics. And fortunately, there are some concrete steps we can take. First of all, resume funding to the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization. I mean, that's an obvious first step. But also we need to resuscitate the global health security agenda. And Juan, I believe you've written about this recently in America's Quarterly. But we've seen the value of collective defense to pandemics. And we saw when we were dealing with the H1N1 virus that actually originated in Mexico. So, you know, there are precedents out there. Another mechanism that's available that we should be taking advantage of and using and resuscitating is the North America Plan for, I think it's the Animal and Pandemic Influenza that was created in 2012 to facilitate cross-border coordination with Mexico and Canada. Okay, so I might have spent a little bit too long on that, but I do want to say a few words about China, Dave, which was the other part of your question. So we shouldn't have been surprised when China stepped in to fill the void. China's turn to medical diplomacy, it was really just the natural next step when it comes to its growing relationship with Latin America and the Caribbean. So the reality is that China is a very important economic partner to the countries of the region. It's the region's second largest trading partner, and China has supplanted the US as the primary trade partner for really big economies like Brazil, Chile, and Peru. And so that's a reality. And unfortunately, the way that this administration is dealing with this is it's really further alienated countries from the United States. I was in Chile shortly after Pompeo's last trip to the region, and I heard from, you know, all sides of the political spectrum, current government officials, past government officials, that they really resented the language that Pompeo used that was basically saying, you're going to have to make a choice. You have to choose the US or China. And then not only that, but then not offering them any sort of alternative form of engagement or any sort of productive agenda for engagement. So it's not surprising. I think that 77% of Chileans have a positive view of China and only 61% have a positive view of the United States. And that was in 2019. My guess is that gap has widened even further. The decision of the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Panama to break ties with Taiwan illustrates the failure of the US approach. It's no coincidence that right after El Salvador made that announcement that, that China announced a huge, much needed infrastructure project in El Salvador. So I think Juan's comments about the importance of the US assisting in economic recovery is critical. We need to provide an alternative to China. We need to engage productively. That means honoring our commitments, like continuing to fund the Central America strategy, which Vice President Biden has committed to actually expanding. And also, I just wanted to pick this point too, that it's also really important that we rebuild our diplomatic infrastructure. You know, Trump has systematically tried to gut the State Department, and we're gonna need our diplomatic forces to deal with the damage that's been done.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the handling of both sides of that question, so I appreciate it. We wanted to turn next to climate change. Juan, in your first remarks, you mentioned that climate change, the need to prioritize climate change and clean energy technologies in the economic recovery in the region. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about that. Last year, 21 countries in the region joined Chile in adopting plans to become net zero carbon emitters by 2050. And the World Economic Forum estimated that the region would require $77 billion in investments by the year 2030 to meet those goals. So in your view, how important is US leadership on climate in the region? And how can the US and countries in the region work together to reduce carbon emissions, especially in the face of runaway deforestation in Brazil?
It's an excellent question, and it's a good segue to what Rebecca was talking about. And I think the unifying theme here is the need to really listen to scientists and respect science. And then I think number two is the reality that whether it's migration, kind of economic fallout, or a pandemic, these are things that cannot be avoided by building a wall. You have to really recognize that the security and the prosperity of Latin America and the Caribbean has implications for our own, and that there's a need not just for US leadership, but also for the United States to work with the region as partners and in alliances to address some of these shared challenges. I would add as well that when you look at the issue of migration, particularly from the Northern Triangle, of course, you have the traditional kind of asylum categories and refugee categories where people are fleeing violence. You have the other categories where people, which has become more complicated as a result of climate change, where people are considered economic migrants. As a subset of that, something that we really are, as an international community, really need to, I think, do a better job of addressing is the growing number of climate refugees that are migrating from places like Hocotan in Guatemala. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there. And people that are migrating because of drought and starvation, but really it's because of climate change and its ancillary impacts are things that we really need to figure out how to measure, categorize, and address. But look, when you're thinking about U.S. climate agenda, I would say a couple things. First is that right now we're not in a phase where we're going to be should be negotiating, but rather trying to rebuild the set of alliances and renewing and reaffirming the commitments that have been made. Because a lot of countries, including China, have fallen back on their Paris commitments. Obviously, the conversation with China is going to be central to any sort of climate agenda. But this is an area where the vice president, in the course of the 16 trips that he took to Latin America and the Caribbean, was hands-on in working with countries like Mexico, like Canada, like Brazil, to really commit to the ambitious commitments of the Paris Accords. I think we need to go back to that, and so in that I think it's an important message to the countries of the region that under a Biden administration, those countries that are ready to be ambitious and really ready to step up and tackle climate change in a really serious way are going to find common cause with the United States. And so what are the mechanisms really that that need to be taken. I would give, and I'll share just a couple here, but I think one of them is you have to look at the different needs of different regions. The Caribbean and Central America, I would categorize as a vulnerable subregion that needs particular emphasis and attention on matters of adaptation. And so when you're looking at that, under Secretary Kerry, we negotiated the Green Climate Fund, which was a financing mechanism to help areas like the Caribbean. Those are good mechanisms, but I think we need to even be more creative to find not one size fits all challenges, but really ones that are tailored specific to the needs of Central America and the Caribbean. Particularly, these are regions that have very high borrowing costs that their tourism sectors, which are the main contributors to their economic prosperity, have been decimated as a result of the pandemic. So we need to find ways, and that's something that in terms of climate finance, the Biden administration has actually identified that as a priority for small island states to work with. The other one is actually investing in the technologies of the future and preparing what are these traditional technologies that are depending on fossil fuels to make that transition. And in that, and this is my final point, and would love to talk about this more in our exchanges, when you look at some of the proposals that the Vice President Biden has put on the campaign trail, I would look at one that has, I think, significant implications for U.S. foreign policy, regardless of where it is. You look at the Build Back Better plan, where he's committed to $1 trillion over the course of the first 4 years of his administration. That is perhaps one of the biggest commitments since FDR in U.S. Revitalizing U.S. manufacturing. But it's not just U.S. manufacturing, like I said, going back to the way things were, but rather in investing in the technologies of the future, making sure that we're modernizing the United States to prepare for climate change as a part of our efforts to revitalize and strengthen the U.S. economy. Well, that's going to have major implications, I think, first for North America, right? And so just as the United States has a framework for cooperating on pandemic response, as Rebecca mentioned, actually, the climate agenda is one that is ripe for North American cooperation. The other one is when you're looking at the need to, whether it's for pandemics or really for economic growth, the need for supply chain resilience and the repatriation of supply chains. That is something that I think is going to benefit not just the United States, but North America, the Caribbean, Central America. And then when you look at, I think, countries like Brazil, which are incredibly relevant in whatever G forum you have, but particularly the G20 and the G77, you need to engage with countries like Brazil, but I would say also Chile, Mexico, Argentina, really on bridging and building a very ambitious global consensus to make sure that countries are stepping up and implementing the ambitious commitments which have fallen back since the Trump administration came in. So those, I think, are areas that are very clear in terms of cooperation. Of course, the Amazon and deforestation is something that is incredibly relevant, and it's been a subject of campaign debate back and forth on the role of Brazil. And again, I'll just emphasize there that under a Biden administration, those countries that are really ready to be ambitious and recognize that climate change is real and are ready to do something about it will find a very easy partner in the United States.
Thank you, Juan. So I will ask one final question of our panelists before we turn it over to the audience. So everybody out there in Zoomalandia, get your questions in if you have them, and then we will start responding to those next. So before we do that, Rebecca wanted to ask you about advancing democratic values. So at the Truman National Security Project, we've gone on record as saying that racial justice is a national security issue. And the reason is because we believe that the U.S. must uphold at home the values we promote abroad. For several decades, the U.S. agenda in the region has included promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And you've, in fact, course, written a book on democracy and the rule of law in the region. So in your view, how important is US leadership on human rights in the region? And how do our domestic policies affect that agenda regionally?
Thanks for the question. As you can imagine, this is an issue that is near and dear to me. And I do think it's worth saying that one of the things that I admire most about the Truman Project is its emphasis on democratic values. And your point about racial justice and its linked to national security, I think that the national security is coming around to see that that's the case. And this idea that it's essential that we uphold, any values that we're promoting abroad here at home. I mean, that seems like an obvious, but it's not happening. I'm sure Jenna will second me in also recommending, when it comes to racial justice as a national security issue, recommending I think it was Bishop Garrison and I can't remember who the co-author was, but it was a foreign policy piece. It was Jenna, if you want to jump in and remind me, but it was an excellent foreign policy piece that is a great starting off point for this conversation. I think it was John Wolfstall, but anyway, it's a great starting point.
Yeah, I'll post the link in the chat.
Thank you. And again, I really appreciate the Truman Project for leading on this issue.
Thanks.
And it certainly applies also to democracy and the rule of law. We're seeing democratic backsliding across the hemisphere, including here in the United States, and rise of elements of authoritarianism. We're seeing, what would be called delegative democracy or hyper-presidentialism supplanting liberal democracy. It's a real problem. We see the degradation of the rule of law. We see the deliberate dismantling of independent democratic institutions, in many countries in the region. And we're seeing it happening on both the right and the left. And here I just want to say that, we hear a lot from the Trump administration, and I do appreciate this, criticizing, authoritarian regimes like, Maduro and Ortega. They certainly deserve it, especially I think today, hopefully everyone has seen the UN report about Maduro's repression and basically crimes against humanity by the Maduro administration. So I'm really grateful to the UN for highlighting that. But it's also happening on the right. Bolsonaro's Brazil is probably the most obvious example, but we also see it in El Salvador under President Bukele, who has brought in the military to pressure Congress. He's ignored judicial rulings. Now he's going after the free press. We see it in Honduras under Juan Orlando Hernandez, who, electoral fraud, packing the Supreme Court so that he could run for a second executive term, even though it was prohibited by the Constitution. So it's happening on the right too, but what's happening is the administration is giving a pass to the guys on the right because they're seen as loyal friends of the administration. And that really calls into question our legitimacy when it comes to promoting democracy and human rights. So, and we've really, here at home, we've really lost credibility. And, in fact, when I look at this state of our democracy, for someone who spent like 20 years of my academic career looking at democracy and the rule of law in Latin America, I see that it's almost as if President Trump has taken a page from the playbook of like your traditional Latin American caudillo. And I was appreciated Senator Menendez's op-ed yesterday, kind of alluding to the caudillo-like tendencies of the Trump administration. He's attacking the independence of key democratic institutions that are essential for the rule, calling the press the enemy of the people. And then one I'll highlight as someone who comes from, who was in the Pentagon under President Obama, this idea of calling on the military to supplant law enforcement. This has been such a key message of the US over the years. There's been this long time trend in Latin America to use the military for law enforcement. This leads to human rights abuses. It takes away incentives to strengthen the police, and it takes energy away from what's really needed, which is judicial reform. But how can we tell the countries of the region that that's not the right path to take when we have, members of the armed forces in combat uniform in Lafayette Square. I mean, we just don't have the moral standing to convey that message. So I think the priority here, Dave, is to get our own house in order. And it's going to take a lot of effort. And I think it's going to take a lot of humility when it comes to regaining our standing, not just in this region, but across the world. One other thing I'll say about advancing kind of this agenda of democracy, human rights, you know, we've been most effective at doing this when we do so in concert with regional and international partners and multilateral institutions. Key examples of this, Juan, you mentioned the importance of corruption as a component of governance, is with the UN-backed CICIG in Guatemala or the OAS-backed CICIG in Honduras. They're examples of the need. It's not like a unilateral thing. This is where we're most effective when we work together. So again, I think it's just another call to rebuild the State Department, to rebuild our alliances, and to kind of return to multilateral institutions.
Thank you for that answer. And we will now start turning to some of the questions that we have from the audience. So thank you everybody for sending your questions in. If there's still time, send in more questions. We'd be happy to curate some of these. We do have one on energy security that I wanted to pass along to Juan, if that's okay. So I'll just read it. It's from Augie, Augie D. On economic contraction, many of the smaller countries in the region spend a high percentage of GDP on energy, which is why they are vulnerable to Petro-Caribe. Do you see energy cooperation as an opportunity? And if so, in what ways do you think the US can aid in this area in a way that helps the region recover while promoting cleaner alternatives?
That's a great question, Augie. But I want to just mention something to build on what Rebecca was saying, just on not just racial justice, but the need for diversity in our foreign policy institutions. We have a State Department that is very undiverse. I mean, particularly under this administration, but I think at institutional level as well among the career ranks, there's been a lack of gender diversity and parity. I think it's important to mention the parity angle, but also just the ethnic and racial diversity across the department. And so that's something that I think is going to be necessary to make sure that our foreign policy is as strong, as well informed as it can be, to make sure that U.S. foreign policy is as diverse in its considerations of matters of democracy, human rights, et cetera, abroad. But look, on energy, Augie, I think you're 100% on the money. The Vice President in 2013 launched the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative, and we never used the word Venezuela, but it was very clear that as Petro-Caribe started to decline, and this was something that came from the Vice President himself, I can't take any of the credit for that. He wanted us to actually find a way to fill that space by being responsive to the Caribbean, as opposed to what traditionally the United States does, which is turn to the Caribbean whenever it needs votes to the United Nations during UNGA, and it usually does it by trying to pressure. The Vice President said, let's try to be responsive to the needs of regions like the Caribbean, and which is a region that is dependent on heavily imported diesel. And he also saw it as a way to actually help reduce poverty in places like Central America and the Caribbean that have, at the time, energy prices were 3 times what they were in other parts of Latin America. And so it was key from a geopolitical perspective to try to fill a space that had been filled by Venezuela's Petro-Caribe. A lot of people that are recent students of the region didn't know that Mexico traditionally actually has this huge influence and presence in the Caribbean. They were pushed out by Venezuelan oil diplomacy programs. So it's something that is going to be vital. But I think right now we need to start thinking of what is a Caribbean energy security strategy for the 21st century. And we were taking at the time an all of the above approach to energy security. So some places were ripe for geothermal. Some places were ripe for solar. So others needed natural gas as a transition. I think we need to start also thinking about, in a post-pandemic environment, looking at the debt dynamics in Central America and the Caribbean. I would include the two together to make sure that a region that is going to be hit the hardest, I think, by the pandemic, how do we actually create the incentives for the private sector to invest in regions like that? I think we need to redouble our efforts to improve energy governance. These are places where you have either vested interests that resist change, or you have a lack of technical capacity to create a regulatory structure that allows that sort of new energies to come into the mix. And then, of course, the international community. This is somewhere where it will surprise nobody on this Zoom call that as much as we talk about it, international donor coordination is incredibly difficult, disparate, and not always effective. I think it's something where the region really needs to prioritize, the international community really needs to prioritize its coordination when it comes to vulnerable subregions, not just in Latin America, but I think on a global level.
Great. Thank you, Juan, for that. I have a question from Greg Weeks for Rebecca. What could a Biden administration do for anti-corruption efforts, especially when many Latin American governments are opposed to them?
That's a great question, Greg. And it's many Latin American governments, and it's also the elite, especially in Central America. So yeah, this is a thorny issue, and my assumption or my guess would be that this is going to be a priority for a Biden administration, based on what I saw, based on his priorities as vice president. Corruption is an issue. He understands the corrosive effect. And like Juan said, he sees this as a key piece of governance. So first of all, you need a president who cares about this. And I would say that, Trump basically stood by and did nothing when Guatemala got rid of CICIG and Honduras got rid of MASI. So, I think other presidents, Republican or Democratic, would not have let that happen so easily. Juan, I don't know if you agree with me, but it was just awful. But I think if we look at Central America and we look at, in the past at the Central America strategy when it came to addressing the root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle, and this is a strategy that Vice President Biden, he was responsible for getting the $750 million to support it, but it had three components to address the root causes of migration. There was the poverty reduction or inequality, dealing with that, dealing with the security issues. People are going to continue to migrate I think 50% of residents in the Northern Triangle fear they're going to be victims of a homicide in the next year. The wall's not going to stop that. Stop someone who's so desperate from coming to the US. But the third very important pillar of Central America strategy was governance. And this is where corruption came in. And if you look at the Biden platform, you'll see the Central America plan. And basically, whereas Trump cut off that much of that funding to Central America, President Biden has proposed a 4-year, $4 billion strategy. And key to receiving the assistance or the money into to address these three pillars is going to be reforms on the part of the Northern Triangle countries. So yeah, this is going to be, I think this is going to be a priority issue. It's going to be an issue, I think, also when we deal with Mexico. I think you've all probably read about this new plan, AMLO's new plan to hold a referendum on whether to prosecute former presidents. If that doesn't smell like a slip away from democracy, I don't know what does, and away from the rule of law. So I think that this issue of corruption in Latin America and the Caribbean is going to be key. But at the same time, I would say this is also an issue that we're going to have to approach with humility, given some of the actions of our current administration. So, and again, this is going to be another example of us having to get our house in order at home, and like I said, then acting with humility.
Thank you, Rebecca. I want to welcome a very special guest we have with us today, Ambassador Anthony Philip Spencer, the Ambassador of Trinidad and Tobago to the United States. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Ambassador. And thank you for your question. That is, other than the Caribbean Basin Economic Recovery Act of 1984, which is focused on trade relations, the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act of 2016 is the most comprehensive legislative instrument for developing an enduring cooperation policy framework for promoting and protecting relations between the U.S. and the Caribbean. What are some of the priorities that you would recommend should be pursued during this decade of action, so 2021 to 2030, for the implementation of the SDGs as declared by the United Nations? Juan, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, David. And Mr. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to hear from you. That is clearly a trick question that you're asking, because I should be asking you that question. Frankly, I'm going to embarrass the ambassador. He is somebody that during my time as Deputy Assistant Secretary is somebody who became a friend and a mentor on how to collaborate with the Caribbean, which is why I mentioned I should be asking you that question. Indeed, the 2016 legislation is somewhere where Congressman Engel showed incredible amount of leadership in really putting that into law. I think created a framework for that. And I mentioned obviously the climate change agenda and the economic agenda on the need to prioritize the Caribbean. I think that the most important thing that the United States can do with the Caribbean is to treat it with respect and this is something that Biden did, which was treat the leaders, the Prime Minister, the presidents of the Caribbeans like he would treat the Prime Minister of the UK, and give them the time, the respect, and the consideration that you would to other major allies. I think that's the most important thing that we can do for a region that we take for granted and whose security and prosperity really does have immediate implications for the United States. The second one is making sure that we have existing mechanisms for dialogue and cooperation with the Caribbean. I know Rebecca's participated in CANSEC. I've had opportunity of traveling as well. There are the CARICON meetings. There's obviously the Summit of the Americas process. I think that the engagement with Caribbean leaders needs to be done regularly and often. But I think the third thing that we can do as well is just like we do with our friends we push each other to be ambitious. And I think some of the challenges that the Caribbean has is that they're small. And the answer to those challenges is to get bigger. And by that, I mean, is regulatory cohesion, efforts at making sure the economies are as integrated as possible, making sure that these existing mechanisms, the Premier Security Coordination Forum that is in Trinidad and Tobago, making sure that these fora are collaborating effectively, are financed effectively. I always thought the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative and the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative were ones, and particularly the Security Initiative, were ones that really could have benefited from increased donor attention. But the challenge, of course, is I think sometimes is the bandwidth of the countries of the Caribbean to execute on some of these ambitious political and security commitments before them. So I think, again, the most important thing is, and you mentioned in your chat, sir, and maybe it's a good segue too, is that the United States is hosting the Summit of the Americas during the second half of 2021. I would love to see a very ambitious theme for the United States that really looks to recognize the challenges, not just in terms of economics, the global pandemic response and recovery, an anti-corruption and pro-governance agenda that Rebecca, I think, articulated very well here, and obviously celebrating these relationships with subregions that really matter to us and like the Caribbean.
Thank you, Juan. I appreciate that, and Mr. Ambassador, I hope Juan helped you out there. I will turn next to a question for Rebecca. This is from Alex Aleman, and it's about a current event. So TPS has been a significant instrument in our foreign policy toolkit toward the region. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on Monday ruled against the current enjoyment on DHS's termination of TPS, thereby allowing TPS to end, or at least for, I think, certain countries, I think El Salvador, but maybe not Haiti. If this ruling holds or is upheld, how will this impact our foreign policy and our relations in the region?
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for that question. It's a good question, and it's, I think you probably suspect what my answer is going to be. But I mean, this, when I first read this, it's going to really further harm our relations with the region. I mean, this is going to impact, you know, more than 300,000 individuals living here in the United States, and their children that were born here in the United States is another issue. And you know, I don't know how you can say that the conditions in El Salvador right now are safe. I mean, the homicide rate, although it's been, you know, gone down a little bit, but you know, we're now kind of learning why. It was the negotiations with the gangs, but you know, the homicide rate is extremely high. All of the root causes of migration that were there at the get-go are still there. In Nicaragua, the scale of poverty, the assault on democracy by President Ortega, the treatment of the opposition, this is just, honestly, it's just cruel. It's a cruel policy, and it's going to further diminish our standing in the region. And it's going to be, I think it's going to be one more blow to our relationship with the region, that it's kind of going to show the essential need to rebuild them, and it's going to make it even more difficult. I don't know, Juan, if you want to add anything to that, because I know this is an issue you care deeply about as well.
I was going to ask if either Rebecca, you or Juan wanted to take a quick stab at Venezuela and TPS.
Well, I mean,
tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, look,
yeah.
I mean, the Vice President Biden has actually called for TPS now for Venezuela. And I think you can't talk about TPS without talking about this administration's broader immigration strategy, which I think at its core is, as you said, it treats migrants with a lack of dignity and respect, and frankly creates a false choice between enforcing U.S. immigration law and upholding our international humanitarian obligations. I think we had to recognize here that the reason the United States has been able to reinvent itself and innovate continuously throughout its history, when regions like Europe have because of their demographics are economically declining, is because we've been able to count with a constant supply of migration that, as opposed to what Trump has said, which is to call Mexicans criminals and rapists, you have people that are packing up everything, risking their lives to come here. So that they're sending their best, their brightest. There's a statistic I read not too long ago that said that there are more Mexican PhDs in the United States than there are in Mexico. And so we benefit from that, and as long as it's done in a regularly, in orderly way. Unfortunately, our asylum system is set up really for post-World War II Europe. It's not really designed to address some of the challenges that we're facing specifically here in the hemisphere. And when you have a country like Venezuela that, the largest amount of asylum applicants at this moment are from Venezuela, the idea of deporting people like that back to torture and to a dictatorship just goes against everything that we stand for as a country. Using CDC guidance to even refuse consideration of Nicaraguan petitions and sending them back to torture. I mean, people have read that article. That's just something that as Americans, we just don't do that. So, you know, I think I got to be honest here. It represents a xenophobia and a fear by some in this country that feel like their place is going to change with the growing diversity that has characterized the United States. I think that's the wrong assessment of what makes the U.S. strong. So I think when it comes to TPS or broader immigration policy, we have to create one that finds that balance between enforcing immigration law, but upholds our international humanitarian obligation, treats people with dignity and respect, and frankly, does not invest in things that aren't going to work, like walls, but rather in the root causes and in addressing and increasing the asylum capability of countries like Mexico.
Thank you.
Can I just add one thing to that on this? Is I just don't, so Vice President Biden has been very clear, as Juan said, about TPS. And I just also want to emphasize that Kamala Harris also, when she was, when she was campaigning for the presidency, also was very, very clear on TPS for Venezuela. And I just want to also, everything Juan said is right on. And I just want to say something else that we should be doing more about is, first of all, I just want to remind everyone here, I think everyone in this call knows this, but the Venezuelan refugee crisis is on track to surpass Syria. We cannot forget that. It's not getting near enough attention. And another reason we need leadership, and a leader who can unite the region is the United States is not doing enough to support the countries of the region that are the recipients of the Venezuelans. Countries like Colombia, that's received almost 2 million. And here they are. It's here they are trying to implement the peace accord. Yes, there are problems there, but at the same time, and there's so much more we should be doing to support the countries around Venezuela. And Ambassador Philip Spencer included Trinidad and Tobago. I know that you are also facing this challenge. So there's so much more the U.S. should be doing, can and should be doing.
Well, thank you to Juan and Rebecca both. I appreciate it. We have arrived at the end. Jenna, if you're still there and open, I wanted to turn it over to you for a few closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think we could go on and on. There's so much clearly to talk about. And Ambassador Philip Spencer's comment about the summit reminded me of being in Port of Spain for the summit that Trinidad hosted. And I still think about that coconut rice. And it is so clear that we have so much work to do before we can really think about the U.S. hosting. The timing will make that all the more urgent, I think, for some quick decisions on the path forward for the region. I hope folks here who are new to Truman and the work that we will do will continue to engage with us. You can find us online at Truman Project and at Truman Center on Twitter. We encourage you to sign up for additional events. We just hosted Stephen Dudley, known to many of you, yesterday on his new book on MS-13, really important work. And our upcoming conference on October 1st and 2nd, The Fires at Home, will really focus on what we touched on here today, which is reclaiming that moral authority and really thinking long and hard about what a democracy-centered and rule of law-centered and anti-corruption platform at home will enable and yield as we think about how we engage abroad. I love that notion, Rebecca, of thinking about strategic humility, right? And how we embrace our challenges in the region. There's so much to be said for showing up and listening. So that's October 1st and 2nd. We'll also feature a panel on immigration as a national security matter and how Truman frames it, which is that it certainly strengthens our national security. We'll also talk about climate. So much more exciting content to come. A special thank you to David for moderating such a terrific panel conversation, and to all of you for joining us for the wonderful and really thoughtful, meaty questions. Great to have so many watchers of the region joining us here today. So signing off and staying true to our time here, that is a wrap for us. And again, thank you to our wonderful panelists. It's been wonderful to be with all of you.